You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister.
Before we get underway, President Elsner and Dr. Britt both wanted to send their regrets. They had a prior engagement that they could not break. They wanted me to thank Yuval, Robert, and all of you, especially Jock Fortune, who is our lead donor for the Fortune Institute. At Marian, we start all gatherings in prayer and reflection, so please join me. God our Father, you guide everything in wisdom and love. Accept the prayers we offer for our nation and people. Please watch over those in authority so that people everywhere may enjoy freedom, security, and peace. As we mark America's 250th anniversary, grant us gratitude for past sacrifices, humility for failures, and renewed dedication to liberty and justice. Help us celebrate with unity and responsibility, learning from our history and working together for the common good. Grant that every person may be guided to their own unique ability and passion to better their neighborhood, town, or city, state, and nation. Give us courage to act with honesty and compassion, wisdom to listen and learn from one another, and perseverance in this experiment. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Marian's vision is to provide an education distinguished in its ability to prepare students for transformative leaders for service to the world. The Fortune Institute and the Fortune Scholars Program are supported by a $5,000 annual scholarship to pursue a minor in civic leadership and capitalism. The program combines rigorous academic study grounded in moral capitalism and civic leadership. Scholars study institutions, practice civic engagement, and carry lessons into action. The minor is open to all students, as we wanted students across professions, engineers, teachers, business people, and beyond to gain exposure that will help them to make positive impacts in or outside of their careers. We are honored to welcome Yuval Levin, joining us virtually from the weather in DC. Yuval is a leading, respected voice on institutions and civic renewal. He serves as Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and is the founding editor of National Affairs. He previously served on the White House Domestic Policy staff under President George W. Bush and is the author of The Fractured Republic, A Time to Build, and most recently, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. In his writing, Yuval reminds us to be hopeful about America rather than just optimistic. While optimism almost assumes good outcomes, hope calls us to action. Second, Yuval reminds us that civics teaches patience and restraint. And finally, the Constitution was designed to hold us together, and we must remember it makes things difficult on purpose at times. Moderating tonight's conversation is our friend Robert Bain, who brings deep experience in public affairs as the principal of Veteran Strategies. He also hosts Leaders and Legends, featuring conversations with the likes of Chris Matthews of MSNBC, Governor Eric Holcomb, former Senator and Ambassador to the Holy See Joe Donnelly, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, Vice President Mike Pence, sports journalist Jackie McMullen, and importantly for us, Dr. Britt and President Elsner. As Robert would say, the list goes on and on. I want to thank both Yuval and Robert for their generosity in joining us this evening and for their flexibility in navigating the weather. With that, please join me in welcoming Robert Bain and Yuval Levin.
Can everyone hear me? All right, so I gave up sweets for Lent. So if I'm grumpier than the last time we all got together, you'll understand why. I would like to take just a second to use the interlocutor's privilege to notice a few folks. Indiana Supreme Court Justice Mark Massa, who's a big supporter of this series, is here. Former state senator, proud East Sider Teresa Lubbers is here. Also, Chief of Staff to Mayor of Carmel, Sue Finkham is here. Thank you all. And last but not least, the best PR person I've ever met is here. Jennifer Wagner. Jennifer, I love seeing you. Thank you so much for coming. Mr. Levin, we're not going to waste any time. Let's get right to it. Would you like to weigh in, please, on the discussion that is happening throughout the country with the foundation that things in America, from a civic, political, and societal standpoint, are worse than at any other time in our history, save for the Civil War?
Well, thank you, Robert, and thanks to all of you. Just first of all, I wish I could be there in person, and we've learned again that the East Coast doesn't know how to handle snow, which I guess everybody already knew. It's really an honor to be with you, Robert. I think it's a good place to begin because there's a way, that history allows us to have a perspective about our own moment that can help us to get out of some of the ways in which we tend to hyperventilate sometimes. This is a moment with problems, with a lot of problems, social and cultural problems, political, economic, no shortage of problems. But I do think that it's very important for Americans to recognize that every generation faces significant, serious, daunting problems. Every generation wonders if it's up to those problems or if it's going to be the one to let down its fathers and mothers and not be able to pass things along to its children. And there have been many American generations that have faced far more daunting problems than we've seen. Certainly, as you mentioned, the Civil War, but the generation of the founders faced a tremendous problem. The generation that followed immediately after them faced a breakdown of civil order and social peace that was enormous and profound. Throughout the 19th century, Americans faced just immense challenges through industrialization, through the debates that ultimately led to the Civil War, through waves of mass immigration and assimilation, all kinds of challenges to the integrity of our society and its institutions. We saw much the same in the 20th century, along with problems of a global nature that really confronted us with the possibility that the free world might collapse. Those were very real, and it's easy for us looking back to say, well, that was always going to work out, and what we face now is uncertain. But the fact is, every generation looks at the future with uncertainty and wonders if it's up to it. I think there are a lot of ways in which the kinds of social challenges that America faced, say, at the end of the 1960s, were more intense and more severe than what we face now. There was much more political violence at the beginning of the 1970s than there is now. I don't mean by any stretch to suggest that should lead us to think that our problems are not serious. They are. But what stands out most about them is not so much that they're enormous as that they're our problems. And it's up to us to see whether we can surmount them. The question is not so much whether our institutions are up to this. They've faced gargantuan challenges. It's not so much whether our country's up to this. The question really is whether we are up to this. And to do that, to withstand these challenges and to live up to them, we're going to have to learn from those prior generations. We're also going to have to do some new things. We'll have to get to know our institutions and our traditions, and we'll have to confront our problems as they are. That's no small thing, but I absolutely think that our country has dealt with greater challenges than this. And at some level, that should offer us a little bit of comfort.
I don't want our discussion tonight to be wholly negative or pessimistic. Are there times in our country's history, it seems that when we need to produce a leader, the United States has always done so in tough times. Franklin Roosevelt, obviously Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, the list goes on and on. But are there times in our history where we've handled dissension
very well?
That's a great question, and I do think that there is this kind of magic by which leaders seem to appear. I'd put George Washington at the top of that list, and then Abraham Lincoln, indispensable man in moments of crisis. But there have also been times when our country has dealt with challenges like this without an obvious, extraordinary leader, and when we've dealt with breakdown in social cohesion, and as you say, with dissension. I would point to the end of the 19th century as the period most analogous to the one we live in now, in a number of ways. It was a time of tremendous change, technological change, economic change, a period of mass immigration that required a lot of the country. It was also a time of deadlocked politics. And I think it's worth our recognizing and looking at our own moment that a lot of what stands out about this time in America is not just polarization. We have a two-party system. We almost always have, and so they're polarized. The parties don't like each other. But what really stands out about this time is deadlock. Our politics has been at 50-50 for a very unusually long period of time. I would say since about the 2000 election, 26 years ago, our politics have basically been tied. Control of Congress has shifted back and forth over and over. The presidency has shifted back a fair bit. And every election result has been pretty close. That's actually not the norm in American history. If you look at American history at any random moment, you're likely to find a majority party holding together a very complicated coalition and a minority party trying to expand its own coalition and grow. Both of those parties are engaged in coalition building, which is the essential work of American politics. For the last 25 years or so now, we've had two minority parties at the same time. And part of what that's meant is that they've lost the knack for coalition building. They think about getting all their people out more than about drawing in people who might not be in the coalition. They don't think about marginal voters. They think about devoted voters. And we've been stuck in this place for a long time. The only other analogously long period is that stretch of the last 20 years of the 19th century. And it was strikingly similar. We had, again, 50-50 period. We had control of Congress shifting back and forth. We had a lot of close presidential elections, two elections in that period where the winner of the Electoral College had not won the popular vote, as we've seen. We had a president win an election, then lose, and then come back for another term in Grover Cleveland, as we've now seen happen. It's not a coincidence. That's what things look like when we're at 50-50 for a long time. But we did break out of that period. And it wasn't a heroic leader. I don't think anybody would say that about William McKinley. It was really a new set of issues that reorganized the party coalition some, and ultimately a capacity to think again in terms of coalition building. And over time, both parties emerged from that period trying to build broad coalitions. I think that's the knack that our politics has lost. And there are historical examples we can look to of when Americans have lost it for a time but regained it by reconnecting with our constitutional system.
I have to say at this point, Charles Hyde, you want to come over here and just trade places with me? We have the executive director of the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Center here who could absolutely go on about that. It's a brilliant center, and Charles does a terrific job. Are things actually worse or relatively worse in the United States, or is technology just that much more powerful?
I think it's a little bit of both. There are ways in which we face problems that are just real. In absolute terms, they are real. I think the breakdown of the family has to come first and foremost in any list of those problems. And a lot of our other challenges are a function of that. Declining rates of marriage drive a sense of a lack of direction for younger Americans, which is an enormous problem we confront now. Has a lot to do with the lower morale of our society in general, a sense that people can't get their lives started, which is not normally how our social problems work. Oftentimes when we think about social breakdown in America, we think about people rushing in too fast, getting going before they're ready. In 21st century America, the problem is people rushing in too slowly, waiting too long, staying at home too long, staying out of the game, staying in their parents' basement. It's actually pretty hard to figure out how to think about changing the incentives that confront people in those circumstances. And that's a real problem. That's not just a relative problem. We also have some economic challenges where the breakdown of America's industrial capacity has really meant for a lot of working people that the economy tells them they're not needed. And that's a very hard place to be, just in sheer human terms. I think we face some breakdowns in our political system that make it very hard for our politics to respond to these problems and to other problems we confront. Congress is pretty dysfunctional at this point, and we've seen power flowing, therefore, to the president and to the courts in ways that are unhealthy for the system. I'm sure we'll talk about that. These are real problems. But I think you're also absolutely right to point to technology as a driver of our attitudes in ways that are difficult for us to wrap our heads around. We've seen a massive transformation in the ways in which people get information and the ways in which people connect with each other. And that has been difficult for us to get used to. Our kids are growing up in an environment shaped by social media and other technologies that just didn't exist when their parents were children. And that kind of novelty and innovation is always a source of cultural problems. So that's certainly part of what's going on here. But I wouldn't just attribute our challenges to communication technologies. I think there's some very real and structural problems to be thinking about, and we need a functional politics to do that well.
Is the problem, or a problem, that Americans have forgotten how to agree, or they've forgotten how to disagree?
Well, you know that I love how you asked that question, because that's very much at the core of the argument of my last book, a book about the Constitution. I think it's easy to look at contemporary America and say, we just don't know how to agree with each other anymore. We're too divided, and we disagree too much. I think that's just not quite right, and that, in fact, it's closer to the truth to say that in contemporary American politics, very often we disagree too little. We are stuck in cocoons with people we agree with, spending all of our time talking about people we disagree with, but very little of our time actually engaged in disagreement across political lines. Even people who understand ourselves as very engaged in politics, so we spend most of our time just consuming arguments about why those other people are terrible, rather than actually being in arguments with them. And that is very bad for the civic health of our society. Our institutions are built to deal with disagreement by bringing people into contact with each other and forcing them to negotiate, to accommodate, to compete, and in various ways to deal with each other, sometimes literally to make deals with each other. That's what Congress is for. That's what a lot of our state and local politics are about. That's what our political media is supposed to be about. That's what's supposed to happen at a great university. And too often it's not happening now because Americans have pulled away from each other and have created these kind of safe cocoons, whether that's in social media and other technology, or whether that's through geographic sorting and just living around only people we agree with. We encounter disagreement more rarely than we should. And so, again, we've lost that knack for engagement, that knack for negotiation, that knack for coalition building. The American system is built on the premise that we're never going to agree with each other, that there will always be a lot of people in our society that we don't agree with. But it's also built on the premise, and this is really crucial to the kind of Madisonian constitutional system that we have, the premise that unity doesn't actually require us to agree. Unity doesn't mean thinking alike and having all the same opinions. Unity means acting together. And the challenge for us is, how do we act together when we don't think alike? I think the American political system is a set of answers to that question. How do we act together when we don't think alike? And the answer is competition on election day. The answer is negotiation in Congress and in the state legislatures. The answer is finding ways to deal with each other. Our system constantly forces us to do that. It doesn't allow little tiny majorities to just have their way. It says, no, you have to grow first. You have to build coalitions. You have to find ways to make yourself acceptable to people you don't agree with. That's where a lot of the frustration we have with our political system comes from. But that's ultimately where solutions to our public problems come from. So to my mind, in 21st century America, we don't disagree too much. We disagree too little. And we have to spend more time engaged with people we don't agree with, trying to find ways to act together and to live together.
A phrase I manage to shoehorn into every speech I write is technology creates expectations. You used to think you pay extra for Wi-Fi in the hotel. Now you wouldn't even go near a hotel. Remember the signs 40, 50 years ago outside places? Color TV. That's what happens. Is there a choice, and is it a false choice, between the transparency that has come with 21st century technology and the ability of elected officials to forge deals behind closed doors? The kind of compromise that you were talking about.
Absolutely. I think that's a question that comes from experience with making deals, because in fact, making deals requires some degree of privacy, of confidentiality. Not only some degree, the outcomes have to be public. If what's happening is a political deal, an arrangement between representatives of the people, people have to be accountable for what comes out of that process. But it's also ultimately pretty much impossible to really negotiate in public, because negotiation is a process of making concessions and gaining concessions from the other side. And if every concession you make is immediately on Twitter, is immediately on the internet and getting criticized, it's impossible. It's just impossible for the system to work. And so I think there has to be a balance between the kind of transparency that modern technology makes possible and the kind of internal institutional life that our political system ultimately requires, especially in Congress. And it's possible to find that balance. There's a way to have a meaningful degree of transparency and a meaningful degree of negotiation. In fact, I think one example of that is actually available to us in the history of our constitutional system. The American Constitution was created by a convention that was held in private. The delegates went to very, very great lengths to keep it confidential. They sealed the windows in Philadelphia in the summer. Have you ever been to Philadelphia in the summer? Just imagine being there 150 years before the invention of air conditioning. You wanted those windows open, but they knew that they had to make the kinds of arrangements and deals they would need, compromises that were required, in private, and then take the result to the public and have a vote, as they did in every state, to see if the public was willing to ratify the Constitution. I think, for example, that in Congress today, it's perfectly fine to have cameras on the floor of the House and Senate. The floor of the House and Senate have for a very long time been mostly performative spaces. People don't really get persuaded of very much on the floor of the House. But in committee rooms, where the real work is done, I think it was actually a great mistake to bring in cameras, C-SPAN cameras, and now the internet, where every moment, every second of committee work is televised. That turns those spaces into performative spaces. And what you find if you go to a House or Senate hearing now is basically a bunch of individual members making YouTube clips, rather than a committee working together to come to some arrangement over a piece of legislation. There's a way to strike that balance, allow committee work to be done in private, and then have the floor televised, and have everybody in that institution accountable for everything they vote for. The public has to know and be able to see what they vote for. And technology makes that much easier in a way that's very good. But not everything benefits from being on the internet live. And I do think that Congress has to, for its own sake, see that there's a limit to the amount of transparency that's appropriate and necessary, because ultimately we need them to negotiate with each other. And that cannot happen in a public setting.
You mentioned your book just a few minutes ago. I bought your book and read it. Mark Massa and I are with you. Only who else read this book? Who's read this book? It's got more words that end in TION than any book I've ever read in my entire life. It takes an incredibly complex set of facts and histories and boils them down into something that's a remarkable read. American Covenant. But I'm going to ask you a question about your subtitle. How did the Constitution unify our nation, and how could it again?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the striking thing when you look at the history of the American Constitution is that it didn't and doesn't unify Americans by ending differences. It unifies Americans by forcing people with different views to deal with each other. And when you look at the structure of the Constitution, the centrality of Congress, which is something we're forgetting now, but Congress is the first branch for a reason. The character of the presidency, the nature of the courts, all of these are built in different ways to advance and facilitate some degree of national cohesion. The framers of the Constitution were very, very aware of the dangers of division and even of diversity. We think of them now as a very, very unified society. And of course, in relation to us, there was much less racial and ethnic diversity. There was there was less political diversity in some respects. But that generation of Americans understood themselves as being very divided by religion in ways that in a lot of ways go further than what we now understand about ourselves, divided by region in ways that run deeper than they do now, and divided politically in ways that mattered a lot. And the question for them was, how can this vast and diverse society, the United States in 1787 was already larger than any of the European nations, how can it hold together and govern itself? And the answer was by competition, by negotiation, by accommodation, by bargaining, by dealing with each other. The Constitution creates a system of interlocking institutions that get in each other's way. It's not easy to get anything done. And that is the point. It shouldn't be too easy. The American system is still very different from most other democracies in the world. The parliamentary systems that you find in Europe allow even the narrowest majorities. If you win a tiny majority in parliament, you control all the power of government. In the American system, if you win a tiny majority, as our parties now recognize, you do not get all the power of government. What you win is a seat at the table. And what happens at that table is negotiation and bargaining with the other side. And so our system constantly requires accommodation. It constantly requires acknowledging the fact that the world is full of people who don't agree with you. And ironically, by facilitating confrontation in that way, it actually facilitates unity and cohesion. And I think the American system, although it's not built for efficiency in quite the way that the European systems are, it's built for cohesion and unity in a much better way than they are. And frankly, as some of those societies are coming to be more divided, more diverse, coming to experience much greater immigration than they have in the past, I think they're finding that their own systems don't allow for unity and cohesion in as effective a way. There's certainly ways in which their systems have some advantages over ours. It's easier to get things done, but there's a very fundamental and significant way in which our system is better. It keeps us more unified. Even though we feel like we're constantly arguing with each other, it's precisely in that way that our society holds together. And I think those strengths are still available to us. If we were better at allowing our constitutional system to work in this moment, we would find that we could also hold together better. So there are lessons for us to learn from the institutions created by the system. We have to learn that Congress should be first and foremost. We've forgotten that. We have to learn that the purpose of the presidency is to facilitate stability. We've forgotten that too. That the purpose of the courts is to prevent end runs around the system. I think we're doing a little better at remembering that one. All of these are ways of keeping our society together, and I think the Constitution can offer us a real lesson in what it takes for a diverse society to stay one, to stay unified.
And it should be noted, we produce better hockey teams than...
Evidently, yes. Right. No small thing.
Centuries of parliamentary systems. This is in your book. It's in every book that's ever written about the late 18th century and the constitutional period, the revolution. The influence of the Enlightenment and the influence of the Bible on the founding fathers. The former seems to be accepted by all, but the latter seems to be somewhat controversial. Should it be?
I don't think it should be controversial. If you look at the history of the founding generation and of the 18th century in general, you couldn't really be surprised that the Bible was immensely influential. The Bible was immensely influential on the founding generation. If you just think about some of the rhetoric of the American founding, the most famous sentence of the American founding is we hold these truths that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. In that one sentence is the premise that we are created, that we have a creator, that our rights come from that creator. These are not ideas that came from nowhere, and frankly, they're not ideas that came from the Enlightenment. A lot of the thinking of that generation did come from the Enlightenment, but what does it mean to come from the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment also is ultimately rooted in a Western civilization that has its foundations in Athens and Jerusalem, in the classical ideas of Greece and Rome, and in the moral and religious ideas of Christianity and Judaism. There is no way around those biblical foundations if you're trying to understand the American founders. And they certainly understood themselves in those terms too.
For decades in American history, civic organizations bound people together in social settings. They seem to have lost some of their influence or attraction. Rotary Club, American Legion, Moose Lodge, Knights of Columbus, Elks, goes on and on. Do you agree with sort of the premise of my question? And if so, how is this contributing to the current state of America?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I think there's always been something about our society that has left us as sort of self-organizers. Americans are people who arrange themselves around institutions that can help them solve their own problems. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French visitor to America in the early 19th century, had this famous line. It's not actually in Democracy in America, but it's in a letter that he wrote to his brother. He says, if you get 3 Americans together, they'll elect a treasurer. And that's about right. That's been right. It's in some ways still right. But I do worry that it's less right than it used to be, because that kind of civic organization, that way of thinking about problems by creating an institution that can help us solve them ourselves, is rooted in the sense that our society's problems are our problems, that nobody's going to just show up and fix this for us. It's up to us. It's up to us where we are. And so the way to address it is not to wait for a government official. It's not to wait for some elite or nobleman. It's to do it. And Americans have always had the sense that that's what's required of us. That's what's led us into the kinds of institutions that fill our civic life. Now, American civic life is still pretty full of institutions, and compared to a lot of other societies, including free societies in Europe and Asia, we do have a lot of civic action and nonprofit organizations dealing with problems. But compared to our own history, we have fewer. And in the experience of the average American, there is less volunteerism now. There is less civic engagement. I think some of that has to do with the fact that we have a sense that some of the biggest problems we have now get addressed by government or by the market. And there's less of a need for us to take them on ourselves. But I would argue that in 21st century America, Americans are gradually changing their mind about that. There is a real sense that we lack agency in American life, and that our government does too, that it's dysfunctional in some important ways, that it's not addressing the problems we have. I think more and more Americans have the sense that they're isolated, they're left out of their own community, and that the problems their community faces are not getting dealt with in the right way. Those are the senses that can lead you into civic life. The answers to that sense of a lack of agency should look like getting together with neighbors, getting together with people in your community, and building some way of addressing a problem you face. Americans still do have that knack, but I think the instinct is not what it ought to be. And a lot of the challenges we face now in American life shouldn't be problems that lead us to think, when is somebody in Washington going to do something about this? They should be problems that lead us to think, what could we do about this? In my church, in my neighborhood, in my community, what can we come together and do? I think it's really incumbent on us to recover that sense, to recover that American instinct. We have a lot to work with in doing that. There are institutions in our communities that we could join, that we could build, that we could be part of. But I think too many Americans have lost the sense that they could do something, that maybe their community actually needs them, that there's a way that they could be useful and valuable. I think helping people recover that is really the civic challenge of our time.
We are just about 4 days past Ash Wednesday. My X feed and a lot of what I read on the news sites was about seeing the longest lines they'd ever seen to get ashes, that there is a religious awakening. We are a Catholic university. Beyond just Catholicism, how important is not a third great awakening, but how important is a religious awakening to this covenant you discuss in your book?
Yeah, it's absolutely vitally important. I mean, I would say, in thinking about the kinds of problems that I take up in my work and that this book and prior ones take up, there's always this challenge of the middle step. I would say, you say, we face this problem, and then X, and then we could rise and address this problem. And what's the X? The X is the will. It's the sense that we're up to it. And how do you get to that point? How do you build that will? That is the great mystery of the free society. A free society is a society where government doesn't tell people what to do. That means that for the right things to happen, people have to want to do the right things. And how do we do that? How do we get to that place? A lot of it is formation and education, but I will tell you that a huge amount of it is religion. There's no way that you can have a free society without some sense people have that there is something above our politics, above ourselves, some set of commitments that has to form us. And that can look different in different religious communities. I'm Jewish and you're Catholic, and religious awakening looks different in these two communities. But from the point of view of our society and our civic needs, they are essential in all of those communities. I don't think there is really a way for our country to recover its spirit without some degree of religious awakening that at least halts the decline in religious affiliation and church attendance, which had declined for most of my lifetime. And ideally, that really turns it around and brings us back to a place where people understand themselves through the lens of a religious conviction and a religious community. That kind of turnaround is possible. You spoke of the prior enlightenment or revivals we've seen in American life. We have been through times of very dramatic declines in church attendance and community affiliation. At the beginning of the 19th century, in the 18 teens and 20s, religious affiliation was lower than it is today, significantly lower in some parts of our society. But there was a real turnaround, an awakening. We've seen several of these. You can't order them up. Nobody knows quite what the recipe looks like. It's not something that our politics can achieve, but it's something we have to yearn for and work for and hope for. And I do think that there are some hopeful signs. I don't think that we are seeing in this moment an awakening on that scale yet, but there are some signs of turnaround. I think of it this way. I think that there was a moment of breakdown in the 20 teens, say around 2012, when a lot of social indicators began to turn dramatically in the wrong direction. When you saw an upswing in isolation, in loneliness, as self-reported by people, you saw an increase in suicidality and actual suicide rates. You saw an acceleration of the breakdown in family life and fertility. You saw an acceleration of the move away from religious engagement. The kind of social breakdown that we began to see in that period. And people attribute it to all kinds of things. Maybe that was when cell phones really got going. Maybe it had to do with various breakdowns in our economy. Nobody quite knows. But I will say, in the last 2 or so years, since about 2023, 24, a lot of these trends, without getting all that much attention, have started gradually to turn around. We've seen a decline in self-reported isolation and alienation and suicidality. We've seen a decline in suicide rates. We've seen an increase in the American lifespan as a result of that. We've seen a dramatic decline in drug abuse and drug overdoses, which had risen horrendously. We're seeing a very dramatic decline in violent crime in the last few years, and we're starting to see a gradual increase in religious attendance. It's beginning in those religious communities that are most demanding, that are most orthodox. Orthodox Christianity and Judaism, and in Catholic communities that are most tradition-minded, and in Protestant communities that are most tradition-minded. That's where it's starting. And I would say maybe most hopeful for me is that it's actually starting with younger people. Now, so far, it's starting with younger men, and we're not seeing it yet with younger women. On the contrary, younger women are still actually continuing to move away from religious engagement. I do hope that changes, because ultimately, you need both in order to drive a real awakening. But there are reasons for hope. It's not that our problems have gone away, but it's worth noticing when there is something of a turnaround. And I think that turnaround among younger people in religious affiliation and engagement and practice, it seems to be real. It's been going on now for a couple of years, and it does look to be really happening.
Earlier today, I had the great honor of interviewing Mrs. Karen Pence for my Leaders and Legends podcast. I got to ask her a question that I'll get to ask you later. That question is, if you could have dinner with anyone in the world, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, anyone living today, whom would you choose? She chose our remarkable Midwest Pope. Not just Catholicism, but how important is leadership? Leadership by example. How important is it to the religious awakening you were just discussing?
Yeah, leadership is enormously important. And it's exactly by example. It's not just teaching, though that matters too. But I think what really moves people is an example of a human being living the kind of life they want to live. A human being who somehow exudes a kind of decency and goodness, matters to people well beyond their own religious tradition, well beyond their own community, their own nation. You can see examples like this. If you look at the transformative power, to take a Catholic example, the transformative power of Pope John Paul II at the end of the 20th century was well beyond the Catholic world. He had an enormous role in the transformation of the entire world away from communism and toward freedom in Europe, and really toward a kind of new era on a global scale. That's not because he converted everybody to Catholicism. That's not what he did. It's because he offered an example of a person genuinely moved by a commitment to the truth, who actually lived by what he taught. And I think that kind of person in any community is a transformative force. We don't have enough of that now. And I think it's something we badly need in 21st century life. Not just arguments about this or that, not just teaching. That matters, yes, but what ultimately matters most, and if you think about your own life, this is how it is. It's about examples. When you really face a moment of challenge, a difficult decision, you don't just ask yourself, what are the rules? What did I learn in my ethics class 40 years ago? You think about a person you respect. Maybe it's your parent, maybe it's somebody you've known in your life, a teacher, and you think, what would that person do in this situation? That's how you really drive change. And I think that kind of leadership is what we need most.
Remind you of Senator Richard Lugar, anyone? The more I read about James Madison, and you go into his brilliance in great detail in your book, the more I believe he is grievously underrated. In what ways are we living in Madison's America?
Yeah, boy, do I agree with that. I think Madison is really an extraordinary figure, and it stands out in that founding generation, which was a generation full of extraordinary people. Maybe the most amazing person in that generation was George Washington in a variety of ways, but Madison stands out because he embodied the kind of ethos that ultimately came to define American political life. James Madison, there are a couple of things to really see about him. He grasped that the core problem would be the problem of division and disunity. The generation of the founders is full of a lot of people who we would readily recognize in political terms now. People who are worried about things like social justice, as Thomas Jefferson did, equality, and people who are worried about things like social order, as Alexander Hamilton did, and the challenge of dynamism and energy in our political life. But James Madison was alone in being a person who worried about social cohesion. He thought that what would be most challenging for our society would be holding ourselves together so that we could have a politics where the demands of social justice and the demands of social order could be worked out, could be debated. He got to this point in a very distinct way. Madison was not a lawyer. He was really, of the people who shaped the American Constitution, he's almost the only one who was not a lawyer. Benjamin Franklin wasn't either, but Madison was a politician, a lifelong politician, the son of a politician and the grandson of a politician. He didn't even pretend to be a farmer the way a lot of his fellow Virginian politicians did. He just lived that role in society. And he understood that what a politician does is work out problems on behalf of the people he represents. And that the core work is really the work of negotiation and accommodation. He was a natural legislator. He loved committees, which I don't understand, but he really did. That's where he thrived. He loved bargaining and negotiation. And he understood that ultimately institutional design creates incentives that drive behavior. And that thinking is absolutely evident in every bit of the American Constitution. The idea that our institutions should be structured so that ambitious people have the incentive to do the right thing. That's not easy to do. And if you think about every bit of our constitutional infrastructure, it's all built, or is intended to be anyway, in that way, in that form. So we very much live in Madison's world. He appeals to me because I think about the Constitution, and I'm not a lawyer either. Madison was a kind of political scientist before the era where that was a title that made sense. He thought about political institutions, and he did us an enormous favor by doing a lot of the heavy lifting of thinking about what our system should be like, and by working in the Constitutional Convention to drive the debate in the direction of institutions that could endure. Our system has endured for a long time. You know, Americans, we like to think of ourselves as a young country, but our system of government is older than pretty much any other in the contemporary world. Only the English can really claim they have institutions that have even the same names as they did in 1800, and those institutions do not do the same things they did back then. Ours do. We have the same system of government. No other society in the contemporary world can claim that. And that durability is a real achievement, and in a lot of ways it is the achievement of James Madison.
We're coming up upon, we're actually in the middle of our 250th birthday year. So books are coming out all the time about not only the Constitution and the Revolution and all of those things, but there's several books that are coming out specifically about 1776. And I interviewed brilliant historian named Tom McMillan, who wrote a book, 1776, The Year That Made America. So much of his book is devoted to the actions, the words, and the influence of Thomas Paine. You mentioned Thomas Paine in your book, American Covenant. The more I read about him, I believe that his influence is ridiculously, grievously underrated. Is that a fair belief that I have? And are historians, political science, having a Paine reawakening?
Yeah, I think Thomas Paine is enormously important. I wrote a book about Paine and Edmund Burke back in 2014 called The Great Debate, which tried to elevate his profile a little bit, but I think you're absolutely right. People don't have enough of a sense of how significant he was for changing American minds, for persuading people about why the American Revolution was justified and what terms it ought to take and what should follow it. Paine was an extraordinary person. He was he argued for a living. That's what he did. That's all he ever did. He was a kind of opinion journalist and activist before those categories really existed. And the effect of his Common Sense, which was a little pamphlet, kind of a short book that he published in the winter of 1776. The effect of that on the minds of Americans cannot be overstated. Paine decided he didn't need to make money from this book. He would let anybody reprint it. It ended up being reprinted in all 13 of the colonies in just an unbelievable number of versions and editions. And it was the most widely read book in late 18th century America, other than the Bible. Everybody read the Bible, and just about everybody read Common Sense. And what Common Sense said was, this is not about taxes, this is not about money, and it's not about politics, it's about human dignity. The American Revolution is about a commitment to the principle that every human being is equal to every other in the ways that matter most. And therefore, what we're starting here is more than just a breakaway colony. What we're starting here is really an experiment in the possibility of a genuinely free society. Not everything that he wanted happened. Paine was intensely opposed to slavery, for example, and it took another half century for the rest of the for America to catch up with his views. It took a lot longer than that, really, of course. He was also a kind of radically democratic figure. Paine wasn't satisfied with the American Constitution in every bit. He thought it needed to be more simply majoritarian and democratic. But the arguments that he made for the need for a society built on the premise of human equality are arguments that have never left the American soul and the American mind. And I think a lot of us walk around repeating things he said without even recognizing it, without even knowing how significant he was. He's absolutely belongs in the upper tier of the American founders, and he's somebody that Americans really ought to know.
Perhaps his greatest accomplishment was surviving the French Revolution.
Yeah, barely.
Just right, barely. If you could invite any founding father to be a guest on your podcast, whom would you choose?
Yeah, I'd want to talk to James Madison. I think we need his advice on a lot of things at the moment. And I think Madison would really understand our moment. He would get the problems we have, because a lot of them really are about a kind of breakdown in our capacity to act politically, to build coalitions, and to work through the institutions we have. So I would love a chance to have a conversation with him. I think talking to Alexander Hamilton would also be interesting. Hamilton had a somewhat different attitude about some of the core questions around the American Constitution. He wanted a much stronger presidency than we have. He had very strong views about the courts. I don't entirely agree with him, but I think we would have a lot to learn from him. The two of them together, and the two of them basically are the authors of the Federalist Papers. John Jay wrote a few of the papers, but Madison and Hamilton wrote most of them. They offer us really an incredible set of insights into our political inheritance. And I think they were both people who, in a funny way, might have been comfortable in 21st century America, because the way they thought about politics was quick and sharp and argumentative. They would have loved the internet. Hamilton especially would have loved to be able to get his ideas out there right now, right away. He was a person who just wrote all night and loved being in the arena. And I'm partial to that kind of politician, and so I would love to have a conversation with either one of them.
Do you think John Adams would have posted on X that Alexander Hamilton was the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler?
There you go. That's exactly what he said. And yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. We think of our political media environment as very, very unusual and novel, because for us, it followed a period where American political culture was unusually kind of unified and cohesive. We had a mainstream media for a long time, from the middle of the 20th century until the last 15 years or so. But actually, that mainstream was the exception, not the norm. And our political moment is much more like theirs, where the pamphlet wars played the part that X plays now, and they were constantly at each other's throats, full of insults that would be right at home on Twitter, at a very, very high pace. And they lived with a political media that was hard to trust, that was partisan, that was fragmented and all over the place. I think they would have been pretty much at home in 21st century America in a lot of ways, for good and bad.
Not to mention the Jacksonian era journalism and the newspapers that became increasingly partisan. This was a question I was going to ask you later, but you just mentioned Alexander Hamilton and the presidency, and we mentioned leadership a few minutes ago. How much did the belief that George Washington would serve as our first president shape Article 2 of the Constitution?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it was on their minds. I would say that there was certainly an assumption at the Constitutional Convention that the first president would be Washington. And in some ways that did shape the kinds of debates they had. But they also very explicitly, a number of times in the debates, at least as we have notes of them, which are all James Madison's notes, almost all, there was someone or other, and several times it was Madison, several times it was Roger Sherman of Connecticut, raised explicitly the point that, look, not every president is going to be a George Washington. We have to think about what this office will be with people who are corrupt, or with people who are prone to excess, or with people who are more like Napoleon than George Washington. They worried about that, and they did think about it. They thought about it in particular when it came to a number of specific presidential powers. The pardon power was a very great concern to the framers of the Constitution. George Mason of Virginia several times raised the question of what happens if a president tells somebody to commit a crime and promises he'll pardon them. How do we handle that? The system doesn't allow for a way around that. George Washington was not going to do that, and they knew that, but they also recognized that there would be other kinds of people in that office. And the presidency is a very powerful office. That was really a reality they did live with and had to think about. So I think it cuts both ways. There are some elements of that office that are what they are because framers had so much respect for George Washington. But there's certainly some constraints on the office that probably wouldn't have been necessary if every president were going to be of Washington.
You mentioned about Congress and the presidency, sort of their reaction. We're going to get to the courts too in just a few minutes. But what do you think's the genesis of sort of the switching of the power between the two? Is it Depression, war, Vietnam, Civil War, that sort of era that television comes into play? So you're used to you want to see one person in charge. Would you pinpoint that pivot?
Yeah. I think all of these are factors, but I would say that we went through a period in the middle of the 20th century where those kinds of pressures drove the rise of an imperial presidency, as it came to be called. And really, the Cold War was also a driving force there. We needed somebody who could take that 3 a.m. phone call and make a decision. And that wasn't something that they thought about in the 18th century. Crisis in the 18th century meant the president will find out about this in 2 or 3 weeks, and will have to make a decision and then send a messenger. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it meant right now, and that unavoidably puts the president front and center. The president is decisive in a way that Congress can't be. But for all that we saw the rise of that imperial presidency, there was also a period of congressional reassertion beginning in the middle of the 1970s in response to Watergate, in response to some of the excesses of the mid-century presidencies, where Congress actually did reclaim a fair amount of power. You saw the passage of the War Powers Act, the Modern Budget Act, various ways of Congress taking control of powers that it had allowed to flow to the presidency. And then, starting, I would say, in the middle of the 1990s and throughout this century, we've seen the slide resume in the direction of the presidency. Congress has turned over power to the president. I think this most recent turn has especially to do with polarization and the growth of the intense partisanship of a 50-50 politics, so that members of Congress, in a way, what we've seen is a replacement of the separation of powers with the separation of parties. And members of Congress understand themselves first and foremost as defined by a party label, rather than as defined by their institutional place. If the president is of their party, they want to help that person have as much power as possible. If not, their only interest is in fighting the presidency. In neither case are they really thinking about their role as legislators enough. I think we've seen that develop now over a long stretch. It did not begin with Donald Trump. It did not begin with Joe Biden. It was happening 25 years ago. I worked for President George W. Bush 25 years ago, and I'll tell you a very quick story about this that really illuminates this for me. In the summer of 2006, in Bush's second term, there was a bill moving through Congress that would have reversed a policy that he had about funding embryonic stem cell research, a very controversial question at the time. Congress was about to overturn his policy. It was going to pass. We knew that. And the president had said that if something like this passed, he would veto it. So we had a very brief meeting with him just to say, this is coming. We want to make sure you're in fact committed to vetoing it. And he said, yeah, I've been saying that for 5 years. That's what I'm going to do. And everybody gets up to leave. Easiest meeting ever. There's maybe 8 or 9 of us in the Oval Office. And as we're getting up to leave, the president says, well, so a veto, what do we actually do? What does that look like? Do I sign something? Is there a public event? Now, this is 2006. The president is in his second term. He had never used his veto pen. And the reason for that was that he had a Republican House that would never have sent him anything he didn't want to sign. And that, in retrospect, and I say I didn't see this in that moment, but looking at it now, that was a failure of Congress already. And we've seen that since then. Whenever the president's party has controlled Congress, which has happened at the beginning of every presidency since Bill Clinton's, Congress sees itself as an appendage of the president. They don't move legislation that he wouldn't approve of. They don't get in his way. They don't think institutionally. They think in partisan terms. And I think it's in some way that is what will need to change in order for Congress to reassert itself. And it is essential that Congress reassert itself. Way too much power has flowed to the presidency. And I think the core constitutional problem we face now is the willful weakness of Congress. That's where reformers of the system need to focus. That's where change needs to happen.
Do you think this weakness in Congress is also fueling the social divide? However, it's amplified by technology, that if we saw people, my mother was left of Khrushchev. Like, she was as liberal could be. She loved Everett Dirksen, Republican senator from Illinois. If Congress got along better and was more productive, would that trickle down to society in your view?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very, very important to see, is that what Congress does when it's working is negotiate through problems. And so it puts our entire political culture in the habit of thinking that the way to deal with problems is to negotiate through them. That's how you do it. That's the only way. When we have a system as focused as ours is now on the president, we think the way to get through problems is to roll over the other side. Just get all the momentum you can and push them out of the way. And we tend to think that the purpose of our politics is to get rid of the people we disagree with. Well, that's never going to happen. And we're further, not closer to that happening than we normally are in American life, right? We're at 50-50. Being at 50-50 is a strange time to think that the next election is going to get you to total victory. That's clearly not happening. And so we have to be in the habit of understanding that we need to work out our differences with the other party, to negotiate, to get something from them by giving them something. That's the only way. We only really see that in action when Congress is working. And so, absolutely, I think a more functional Congress would help our political culture be healthier too.
My belief is, and this came from reading this part of your book about the 50-50 sort of society where we are in politics. I do public relations for a living. It seems to me that the only way to energize your base, and your base is more important in a 50-50 situation, is through crisis messaging. Everything's a crisis. Every election is the most important election of all time. Now that we know that Nixon was framed, it's about time we knew that. According to James Rosen, his latest article in the last week or so, everything has to be the worst ever. How does this sort of rhetoric hurt our politics and our society?
Yeah, I think that's what drives it, is this sense that what we need is to get the people who are already on our side even more worked up to make sure that they go out and vote, rather than what we need is to win people we haven't won yet. And that creates an incentive, just as you say, to understand this moment as the life or death moment for our society. Fact is, this is not the life or death moment for our society. That's good news. We're not about to die. But it also means that we have to think about the future. And if you look at our politics in the last now full generation, you step back from it and just listen to what people say. The striking thing is about it, we don't really talk about the future. We talk about the next election, but we don't talk about the next generation. We don't think about what is America going to need in 30 years that it doesn't now have. That's what a functional politics would need to be about. And that can only happen when we don't assume that if the wrong people win the next election, then the whole thing is over. We're at the edge of the abyss. It's almost an escapism to think that way, because then you think, well, we don't have to worry about the long-term problems. We don't have to worry about entitlements or infrastructure. We just have to win the next election and push these damn people out of the way. But that's just not true. If that's all you know how to do, then you're not serving the future of our society well enough. And so I think it's absolutely critical to understand the debates we have in our politics with at least a medium-term view, to see that what we're trying to do is build something that our children can inhabit, is address problems that we have so that they're not worse for our children's generation and beyond. That's what a functional politics would need to do. And that kind of politics would really have to think about coalition building. Because one thing we're not going to have is a society that's all of one mind, that's not divided about the big questions of the day. We'll always be divided, but that doesn't mean that we can't be addressing long-term problems. It means we have to be addressing those problems.
Accepting the first, of course. Do you have a favorite constitutional amendment?
Oh, interesting. Accepting the first. So yeah, the first would be my favorite. I think the First Amendment is an extraordinary American achievement and really makes us unique and distinct. If not for that one, I have to say, I think the hardest won amendment, the one that was most needed and most difficult to achieve, was the 13th Amendment. The amendment that ended slavery required a civil war in which 700,000 Americans killed each other on battlefields. And ultimately, the fact that that struggle, which was won by the Party of Freedom and Equality, led to an amendment to the Constitution that put it into our fundamental charter, that we really mean it when we say that we are all created equal. I think that amendment speaks to the character of our society. It speaks to the difficulties we've faced in really living out that character. It shows us that for all of our highfalutin rhetoric and great slogans, it takes more than slogans to really live by the truths that our country was founded in. And to have those words embedded into our fundamental political charter is to remind us that we are imperfect, but that we also are capable of improvement and of learning from our own best selves. There have been a lot of amendments that have done some good to our system, but I think that one was the most essential and ultimately the most meaningful.
You say it took more than slogans to make the 13th Amendment what it is and was. You discuss another amendment in your book. Instead of slogans, did it take the 14th Amendment to make the 13th Amendment what it is?
Well, yeah, I think the 14th Amendment, which ultimately it enshrines a commitment to equal treatment under law for everyone, was an essential next step from the fundamental commitment of the 13th Amendment to end slavery. It said not only are we ending slavery, but we actually are committed at the national level and not just among the states. We actually are committed to treating all Americans equally. The 14th Amendment involved a rebalancing of federalism. The original Federalist Compromise said that the national government has a few discrete roles. It's in charge of commerce and economic policy, and it's in charge of diplomacy and defense. And that's it. Everything else is done in the states. The 14th Amendment added one more responsibility, and that is the commitment to the equal protection of the laws for all Americans. That's not a small thing. It was a major rebalancing of American national life. It took a long time. In some ways, it is still taking a long time to really apply and live by that commitment. The 14th Amendment has also created a lot of disputes and disagreement in our political life. Those are still alive. There's still a question about exactly what does the 14th Amendment mean when it comes to the treatment of various different kinds of groups of Americans. Where are the limits of what it requires? How should we understand and apply it? But I think those are all questions that force us to ask ourselves who we are. And without a doubt, the 14th Amendment was a great national achievement.
Reform is a loaded word. or a dirty word, depending on who's actually saying it and whose views are being contemplated. Are there any potential reforms of our government, our federal government, that you find intriguing? I'm going to mention just 4, and you can say that Emperor Levin would say yes or no. Pardon power, expanding the Supreme Court, eliminating the filibuster, eliminating the Electoral College.
Well, there's a real mix there for me. I have come to the view, and I would not have said this to you 10 years ago, that we could really use a constitutional amendment to constrain the pardon power. I think the pardon power has become the most corrupted of the presidential powers. There was real debate about the pardon power, as I mentioned before, at the Constitutional Convention, and there was even a specific idea proposed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who said that the pardon power should be used like the appointment power. The president should propose pardons, and they would only take effect if the Senate approves them. I don't think that was necessary for most of American history, but I do think that now our last several presidents, really in some ways every president since Bill Clinton, has in one way or another used the pardon power in a way that the framers would have thought was corrupt and that I think is corrupt. Last-minute pardons of political allies. President Biden pardoned his family and friends in very, very broad general ways. President Trump has pardoned people who have given money to his family. That is the definition of corruption. I think we've gotten to the point where the pardon power should be reformed along the lines proposed at the Constitutional Convention. I would take Roger Sherman's amendment exactly and say the pardon power should be subject to Senate approval. The president should propose pardons, and they should take effect if the Senate approves them. There's a downside to this. I think there would be fewer pardons, and pardons on the whole are a good thing. There should be a mode of leniency in our justice system. But I think we've gotten to the place where that power has become corrupted. It's a bipartisan corruption, so that the need for doing something about it should be evident to people in both parties too. And I think an amendment to constrain presidential power would be healthy for our system now. And of the possible options, that's probably the best one, the one that would do less harm and the most good. I don't think that I'd favor any amendment that changes the situation of the Supreme Court. There are arguments for them. There are arguments for term limits. I think ultimately those arguments fail on practical grounds. If we ended up with a constitutional amendment to limit Supreme Court terms, the most commonly proposed idea has been 18 years. That's a number that would allow every president to have 2 appointments. I think that would really corrupt our presidential politics. People would be running for office based on who they promised to appoint to the court. And I don't think the court is the problem. I think in the moment we're living in right now, the court is much more the solution than the problem. And I don't think we should introduce new sources of trouble when they're not necessary. I think very much the same way about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is vital. It is a way to enable the president to be elected by the same electorate that chooses Congress. And it's a way to allow the federalist character of our system to be represented in presidential elections. And it means that our presidential elections are fought out in the ideological middle of the country. If we just had national popular votes, the elections would be fought in California, New York, and Texas and Florida. And that's it. You'd never see a presidential candidate anywhere else in the country because that's where the population is. And if you win those states, you win the election. The Electoral College says it doesn't matter where the biggest population centers are. You've got to win the places that could go either way. And that means you've got to speak to the middle of the country. So if you're a Republican, you can win as big as you want in Texas, get every last Republican out. Too bad. If you didn't win Georgia and Michigan, you didn't win the election. And what's distinct about those places is that people need to be persuaded. And those people could go either way. That means our politics is more moderate than it otherwise would be. And the Electoral College does us a huge favor that we don't even think about by keeping our presidential elections in the middle in that way. Finally, the filibuster. The filibuster is pretty much my favorite thing about the contemporary Congress because it's actually the only reason why we have any bipartisan legislation. Again, I think people don't think about this enough. In the absence of the filibuster, tiny majorities could do whatever they want, and then they'd be replaced by a tiny majority in the other direction, and everything would get reversed. The filibuster means win enough of the opposite party for this to endure. And all of the bipartisan legislation we've had in the last 20 years has been a function of the filibuster. It has also prevented us from doing some very, very stupid things. Nationalizing election administration in both directions. We've now seen both parties try to do this. That would be a very, very bad idea in a society as diverse and decentralized as ours is. And the only reason we haven't made that stupid mistake is the filibuster. There are all kinds of other mistakes that it saved us from. I think the character of the Senate is a very, very important feature of the Constitution. The filibuster is not constitutional. It's a Senate rule. It could be undone by the Senate, but I sure hope it is not undone by the Senate. It's very important.
Last one, forgive me, I forgot to mention it. Term limits for Congress.
Yeah, I'm against term limits for Congress because I think that ultimately that's a solution to the wrong problem. Term limits encourage short-termism. They prevent members from thinking about their obligations to their constituents and force them instead to think about their next career step. The problem in Congress is not the oldest members. If you just look at Congress and ask yourself, who am I worried about? It's not, in fact, the member who's been there for 10 terms and has become a committee chairman and has thought through the nature of the institution. It has much more to do now with those performative members who are native to social media and think of themselves first and foremost as podcast hosts and only secondly as legislators. Term limits at this point would fill Congress with that kind of member and would empty Congress of the kind of member who thinks that their career depends on having a good relationship with the people who sent them to that institution. So I get the populist logic of wanting to do that, but I think it just doesn't think through the actual logic of a legislature. And I'm very much against term limits.
Chris, do I have time for the 5 questions? Okay, we've reached the point where you get to answer the same 5 questions as people such as, who have I had on? George Will, Larry Zonka, various other historians and such.
All right.
What was your first job?
Well, that depends on how you define it. So my very first job, I worked on a construction site for my father as a high school student, and it taught me a whole lot, I will tell you. It taught me, first of all, that I should go to college, and I'm grateful to that. People work very, very hard when they work construction. I have enormous admiration for them. I don't work nearly as hard, and frankly, I'm glad. My first job in politics was working for a wonderful member of Congress named Bob Franks, a Republican from New Jersey, who really taught me that you can be a decent person, even in a system that sometimes leans in the direction of corruption and failure. He was just a great human being in a Congress that was in the process of breaking down, and I have huge admiration for him.
What was your first concert?
Wow. My first concert was Tom Petty at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, where I grew up. There was a lot of marijuana in that place. I didn't smoke any, but I'm sure I inhaled some.
So should we legalize it?
No, I don't think so. I think that's been a failed experiment so far, at least where I live.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Wow. Well, okay. That's a great question. I think if you care about American political life and American culture, you should read Democracy in America, a book written by a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, a long time ago in 1830. But it is a book that will teach you a lot about your country in this moment. I've never regretted rereading that book. I've read it over and over since I was a college student, and it's just amazing.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I'm tempted to say that I'd want to be there for the American Revolution, but frankly, if I could have been there at Sinai when the tablets were given, that's easy. The top place I'd want to be.
Last question before I turn it back over to Chris. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Yeah, it's a hard question. And I have to admit that I'm just going to steal Mrs. Pence's answer, because the most fascinating person to me in this contemporary moment actually is the new Pope. I'm not Catholic, but he's a person who has thought very deeply about the relationship between technology and morality and culture. There are very few people who have given it that kind of thought. I think he's going to be doing a lot of important teaching on that front, and I would love to spend a couple of hours learning from him about it.
Plus, you have to love someone who, from the Pope Mobile, heckles Cubs fans. Thank you, Dr. Levin, very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yuval, thank you for your time and your generosity and being willing to do this. Thanks to Teresa Lubbers, who helped set this up. And thank you for coming. That concludes the event.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.